Following the introduction of YouTube in 2005, podcasting transformed American comedy. Pioneers like Louis CK, Marc Maron, and Doug Stanhope used podcasting to reach audiences, be creative, build their careers, even transition to careers in cable television when they were comedians who were doing something a little bit dark, a little bit different. They were outsiders and they were not made for TV. As many scholars have documented, including Vincent Mazurko in his piece in Celebrity Studies on WTF, the podcast, podcasting became known as something which was authentic. And it was authentic in these terms. It had a different structure to television or American radio. It could be any length. It didn't have to have a beginning, middle, and end. It could be streaming off on a tangent. Conversations were also full of personal disclosure, almost like therapy, finding the darker parts of human experiences. This contrasts with the old days of the American television industry. Scholars like Gerald Nachman had noted in Rebel Comedians in the 1950s, gatekeepers like Ed Sullivan stopped new upcoming comics from making their names by essentially selecting who could and who couldn't go on the air. Jackie Mason, for example, apparently flipped him the bird one time, which meant that he spent years, as Colin to Nachman, years wandering in the wilderness of entertainment. For a long time in American comedy, really since the 1950s, getting a sitcom had been the logical next step in your career. Essentially, you build your profile, maybe in live entertainment, you work in radio, we're thinking of people like Lucille Ball, and then you get your television program, which is an adaptation of your radio show. But these are were very strictly controlled by executives. So you would have, for example, David Mark's scathing critique. This was in his book Comic Visions. He says that a complex system of checks and balances among advertisers, networks, and production companies continuously negotiates problems of textual dissent while the audience is kept at arm's length. This is also reflected by Susan Murray in her book Hitch Your Antenna to the Stars, in which she talks about the limitations and the way executives would scrutinize what she says is sexual or ethnic content or anything that smacked of political controversy. This contrast between the natural intention of American comics and the restrictive television industry is no clearer than in the case of Robin Williams. Think about the super sterile, family-friendly Robin Williams in the series Mork and Mindy, and compare this to the wildly hilarious, drug-taking, alcoholic, hedonistic Robin Williams who you would see in live performances. We can understand the appeal of podcasting when we think about how it creates stardom differently. This was described by Kate Egan and Sarah Thomas in their studies of cult stardom, in which they suggest that authenticity is created through some offbeat performances which serve to differentiate performers from the mainstream. This could be in disclosing parts of their natural or private selves, but also in the form of the works that they appear in. Anything which disrupts the traditional formulas. So podcasting completely breaks with the structures and the narratives that we've seen in radio and television. So who were these pioneering comedians who began the podcast wave? One of them is Doug Stanhope, a notoriously underappreciated American comedian in the US, known outside, often in European countries and largely in the UK. He's had some incredible shows which are extremely provocative, talking about ideas of nation, identity, shows like Take the Edge Off and Deadbeat Hero, look them up on YouTube. He's also been described by The Guardian, Sam Wollaston in The Guardian, who said that he is America's most abrasive stand-up. So the dark, countercultural comedy of Doug Stanhope's material is not made for TV. It never was, not for the US controlled by executives system, but it was free running on the podcast. So the podcast allowed him to communicate with his audience in a way that he just couldn't before. And this even received some coverage. So we got Pete Norton in The Telegraph. He praised Stanhope as an outsider, saying that it won't be to everyone's taste. Expect coarse language, loose morals, edgy jokes, but there is a certain Hunter S. Thompson charm to it. So by producing this dark, offbeat comedy, using his podcast, using digital platforms, Doug Stanhope has become a very respected comedian in the US, just not to the majority of the public who are watching things like network TV and maybe Netflix. He's had one show on Netflix. Another great example of a podcasting comedy pioneer has to be Marc Maron. Marc Maron is someone who appeared on US television many times. So he was on Letterman 7 times and he was on Conan O'Brien 32 times. But he could never break through and get that mainstream TV show, not the network show. So, appropriately, Tim Goodman in The Hollywood Reporter, this is what he said about Maron. He was never funny in that way that could be boxed up and stuffed into a brightly lit network sitcom with a laugh track. He was always darker and more cynical. So it wasn't until his podcast WTF that Maron actually made his career. So there were a couple of big landmarks from Marc Maron. The first has to be the appearance of Louis CK. This was back in 2010 in episode 111, where they had a reunion and they talked about the problems in their relationship. That was a very organic episode, and Maron said himself in an interview, all the emotional stuff just sort of happened. That episode with Louis C.K. was also praised critically. So at the time, Slate, this is 2010, remember, they're covering podcasting, they said about it, this was David Haglund and Rebecca Onion in Slate, they said it is the best podcast of all time. And it was clear that not only was WTF a wonderful thing, but the podcasts themselves were a remarkable form. The second landmark for Marc Maron was when President Barack Obama appeared on an episode and came to the garage in his house and they had like snipers on the roof and stuff. This seemed unprecedented at the time, but it was part of a bigger trend where politicians were starting to move into digital spaces. We think of this as a very contemporary thing. We think about the recent elections, but Obama did this podcast interview with Maron, and he appeared on the series Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. So the end result is that podcasting transformed American comedy. It gave a platform to those who didn't really have a platform or had to pass through a lot of gatekeepers in order to get one. It opened the way for other mainstream comedians to start to replicate the podcast format. So you have things like Jerry Seinfeld doing Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, and Norm Macdonald doing his Norm Macdonald Live, which is amazing if you can track that down. So we may no longer have that shared comedy experience unless someone is in your little niche and living in your algorithm. But you could argue that American comedy is a lot funnier.